a member of, I am a member of the National Officials Committee and the architect of the group mentoring program, which many of you are part of. And we thought, Louise Buscus and I thought that providing some training on World Para Athletics for those who have already been trained or even not might be of value. So if any of this that we go through today or tonight is new, then that's great. If it's old, if it's all old, we won't be offended if you leave.
But it'll
Okay.
cost.
Jerry, if you want to flip to the next slide now.
You bet, sir.
So we are Jerry Clayton and David Weicker, and we are both WPA educators and technical delegates and ITOs. And in addition, I am also a member of the International Panel of Chief Judges for Photo Finish. Okay, Jerry, flip. We will go through this presentation fairly quickly, but the objectives are to help understand athlete flow and essentially in major competitions within para-athletics track events. Secondly, to gain some insight into the different rules applying to different sport classes within the call room and on the field of play. And thirdly, to talk a little bit about the post-event control center and the technical information center, as well as the call room. Okay. So first, the post-event control center. It's a place where all athletes go immediately after completion of their event or events. And it's where athletes pick up their accreditation, et cetera, and where they find out about victory ceremonies as well as doping control. Now, it's important to note that coaches and team managers are not allowed in the post-event control center, even for para-athletes. The Technical Information Center, or TIC, is a place where athletes, coaches, and team managers can get technical information about the specific competition, including any forms or all forms for requesting anything. That is assistance that's not already included with the sport class, protest and appeal forms, etc.
We're going to read everything.
Not really. The call room is a place where athletes go to check in for their events and where all inspections are done. Some of this is really important, which is why I'm reading it. Coaches and team managers are also not allowed in the call room once the competition has started. Usually there is a presentation that shows coaches and team managers what the call room looks like and the flow of athletes through the call room to the field of play. And the purpose of a call room is to make sure that athletes are ready or competition ready for their event. It's the only time when they are under one roof in a secure area. And it's important to note that the call room is part of the field of play, and athletes must abide by the rules and regulations of the meet when they're in the call room. And that's why we have a call room referee. So the call room referee can make decisions if the call room staff are not able to make a decision on an activity or something that the athletes are doing. It's the first point of contact at a competition venue after a warm-up facility. So athletes will go to the call room after they've been to the competition, after they've been to the warm-up facility, they go through the call room. And sometimes there's 2 call rooms, sometimes there's only 1. Athletes can be disqualified if their equipment does not meet the rules and regulations for their sport class. WPA rule number 6.16, non-compliance on equipment. And they get a yellow card for the first offense, and they would get a red card for the second offense. Now, this includes whether or not they have blades that are too long, or a wheelchair that doesn't meet qualifications or standards, or if they have a throwing frame for seated throwing events that doesn't work. Those are examples of how their equipment might not meet the rules and regulations for their sport class and their event. Now, if it's deemed that athletes are doing this on purpose, they can get a red card immediately. They normally will get a yellow card on the first offense and a red card for a second offense. Now, this is also not a way in which athletes can get out of competing in further events in the competition itself. Okay, Jerry. During COVID-19, the size of a call room and functions or duties of call room staff will likely change. Even now, even now when we're dealing with Omicron and other variants of COVID-19. Call room staff need a bit more space. There'll be less judges and volunteers, and call room staff will likely be working with a different timetable or schedule of events. And there will often be less athletes in the competition itself. So the call room personnel take track athletes to their appropriate start line with the event sheet and any assistance forms they might have if they require assistance forms. And the type of assistance that athletes may need includes helping with setting up their starting blocks, etc. Okay, Jerry. Now I'm going to turn over to Jerry so you can hear a different dulcet tone.
Thank you, David. Just want to speak a little bit about the different sport classes that our athletes fall into. There are several based not on their disability, but the functional limitation that is inherent in that disability in a sport. So we have our visually impaired athletes. There you see the nomenclature used on the start list and everywhere else is a T for track or F for field, 11 through 13. In general, in most of these nomenclature elements, the lower the number, the more severe the impairment is. Not always, but that's a good rule of thumb for you to remember. The track and field 20s, intellectual impairments, they're required to undergo an intellectual evaluation by a neuropsychologist. And there are certain criteria that they have to fall below on those tests in order to be able to qualify for being listed in this category. The T and F 31 through 34, these are the seated athletes that have disabilities like cerebral palsy and brain injury, but essentially these are movement disorders. So their movements are somewhat disordered. The athletes have some limited ability to controlling movement sometimes. I won't go into all of that detail, but suffice it to say, The lower level injuries are the more impaired, and these are the ones that are seated. The 35s through 38s are the ambulatory version of the cerebral palsy athletes, coordination impairments, but they can ambulate. 35s have still significant disabilities, whereas the 38s, sometimes you watch those 38s when they're running and they almost don't look like they have a disability, but they do. The TF 40s and 41s, short stature. The older term was dwarfs. It's not used as much more these days. Essentially, the 40s are shorter than the 41s. The TNF 42s, the 44s are athletes whose lower limbs are affected by a limb deficiency or a leg length difference. They might have the ability of their muscles to generate power affected, and their ability to move their limbs across a joint. And you can see here it says range of motion, that's the technical term, may be significant for these athletes. The 61 through 64s are somewhat similar to those 40s in that they have a lower limb deficiency, but they have amputations, so they wear a prosthetic device. And that is the big difference between these last two categories. The 45s through 47s also have amputations, but they are upper limb deficiencies with impaired muscle power and range of motion issues going on. And there's another class of athletes, you may or may not have seen this. Race runners is the older term. After the Paris Paralympics, the term is going to be in the rule book as a frame runner. Currently, we think of these athletes as the 31s and 32s. And what they do is they use what looks like a large tricycle. It has a pad in front in which they can put their chest and they can hang on to the steering bars, and they propel that device with their feet. And after Paris, their classes will be called the 71s and 72s. We're currently working on the classification system to define who falls into one category. Anybody have any questions on what we covered so far? Just let us know, Sherge, if anybody pops up with a question.
No problem.
Okay.
Nothing.
David?
Okay, so getting back to call room, some specific issues for the T and F11 category. They must wear eye patches and cover their eye cavities, plus wear an eye mask or an approved opaque glasses. And that doesn't matter if they don't have eyeballs or not. The whole purpose of wearing the eye patches and covering the eye cavities is to ensure that everybody is on an even playing field. Now, what's important about this is that athletes are responsible for providing their own, but even so, some will not show up with eye patches to the call room or opaque glasses, and in some cases even tethers, even though they are responsible for providing them. And so athletes or call room officials may end up providing them. T11s must also run with a guide runner, and they must use the tether properly, and the guide cannot finish before the athlete. That's an important distinction. Okay, and if you go one more slide, the eye patches look a little bit like what's on the left, and an eye mask looks like what you get on an airplane for covering your eyes and blocking out light. So they must wear the eye patches and to cover the eye cavities, plus wear an eye mask or approved opaque glasses. And once more, and this is what the tether looks like, and it has basically three parts that Jerry's showing, or we're showing here. There's the minimum distance between the two fixed stoppers is 10 centimeters. And the two stoppers are the red pieces. The second thing is there's a holding loop, and you'll find athletes that will put their hands in there. Some athletes will put their wrist in there. So it's wrist to wrist, or it's hand to hand, or hand to wrist, or wrist to hand. If a tether breaks in a race, the athlete is disqualified. They are responsible for the tether to make sure it's durable and serviceable. So now what you will see on the right side in the white box is that the maximum length of the tether for track events is 30 centimeters. And for off track, it's 50 centimeters. And while they have to, and this is for any T11 or T12 athlete who has decided to run with a guide. So anytime there's a guide involved, they must use a tether, and they must use it properly. And properly means not letting go of the tether until both the athlete and the guide runner have passed the vertical plane of the finish line. Okay, Jerry? And the guide must not finish first, as I've mentioned. For T12, they may run with a guide, so they have the option of running with a guide or without. And you will find some T12s who used to be T11s, but their eyesight has somehow gotten a little bit better, or there may be T13s moving down to T12 because their eyesight is getting a little bit worse. They may run with a guide, and the T11s moving up to T12 probably will, and the T13s moving down to T12 probably will not be using a tether or a guide runner. Okay, Jerry? So what do we watch for at the start of a T11 and T12 race? Well, the first thing is that the guide will set the blocks for the athlete, and this is permitted and it's fairly normal, but it's also fairly slow, or can be slow, because the guide runner has to set the blocks for the athlete as well as for himself. Non-guided T12 athletes will take less time, but they are allowed to have an assistant to help set the blocks, but the assistant must leave the field of play once the blocks have been set. For guided athletes on echelon starts, the guides in the outer lanes will observe those in the inner lanes to ensure that the outside pair are not on their marks too long. So there's a lot of showmanship in this event, in the T11 and T12 event with guide runners. And it will be a judgment call on behalf of the starter as to how long is a fair start to hold the athletes, as long as they're not delaying the competition. Okay. Now, also important is that we use lanes 1, 3, 5, and 7 for athletes who are T11 or T12. And it doesn't matter if it's a 9-lane track or not, you always use lanes 1 and 2 called lane 1, 3 and 4 called lane 3, 5 and 6 called lane 5, 7 and 8 called lane 7. And you normally will only have the lane markers for 1, 3, 5, or 7. And this applies whether or not T11s or whether T12s are using guide runners or not. They still are allowed 2 lanes, and they can set their blocks in any lane they want. But if they and you will see a picture coming up of how you set the marks for the lanes, how you will extend the lane marks for starting. So,
David, would
yep,
you,
go ahead,
would you
Jerry.
say that it's common for the start list to only list those odd numbered lanes and not say 1 and 2 or 3 and 4?
Yes, that's correct. And the athletes can choose whether or not they're going to run in lane 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. So the athletes can choose where they want to start. And so as we've mentioned, T11 and T12 use 1, 3, 5, and 7, and they're given 2 lanes to use. They are a team. That's an important part. So if there's a false start on behalf of the guide runner, then the whole team is disqualified. The athlete and the guide runner are disqualified. And they must, you must use or in an international competition, the starting blocks are usually connected to a start information system. And they will be for our national championships in June, where a start information system is being used as well. If either the athlete or guide runner runs completely out of a lane on the curved section, and it could be the 800 before the break line, then the team is disqualified. So if they run completely out of the lane, it's a DQ. But if they step on the line, they get 2 tries. Isn't that correct, Jane? And what we will find is wheeling or stepping on the line. This is the new rule. It's coming into effect. It hasn't been affected for WPA yet, but wheeling or stepping on the line is not a DQ if it occurs only once in a race or in a multi-round event, and no material advantage is gained. It's recorded in the results and the start list for the next round. And if it occurs again, then the athlete is disqualified. So there's an L put on the start line, start list, and the L signifies that it's a lane violation. And it might be a yellow, it might be a YC with an L after it, or it might just be an L. Okay, Jerry? So for races completely run in lanes, wheeling or stepping completely over the line is a DQ. Some part of the foot, shoe, or wheel must still be in contact with the line, or it's a DQ. For races not run completely in lanes, and if no material advantage is gained, 1 step on or over the line is not a DQ. So that's might be the 800, or it might even be a 200 or 400, which are completely in lanes. And it might include a 5,000 or a 10,000 meter event, which starts with a split start. Okay, Jerry, next. This is how the extension of the line is drawn. And you can see what's circled there. And that's for an 800 meters in lanes 3 and 4. And then the next one to the right is 5 and 6. And you would normally do these in completely white tape. And so starters assistants may want to have white tape in their sort of kit. And the start line for lane 1 is not normally extended because it's already extended. Just because it's the finish line for lane 2 is the start line for lane 1 as well. So again, start lines are referenced in the starting list as odd numbered lanes, which effectively means lanes 1, 3, 5, and 7 are listed. And you can see these athletes in what could be a 200 or a 400. I believe it's a 200 meter race. Okay. Jerry? Yeah, so what you will see here, you will notice that this is a T12 event because for 2 ways you can tell. 1, there are no guide runners, and 2, they are not wearing eye masks or goggles or eye patches, anything. And you will note that the athlete in lane 7 has the blocks set on the line, which divides lanes 7 and 8. And the athlete is essentially running. The athlete can run in lane 7 or lane 8. And what you see here is completely acceptable because they're allowed 2 lanes. Okay. So other considerations, we say linked to technology. Unguided T12 athletes must have the correct set of blocks and linked to the start information system where the start information system is being used. And technology providers at major meets will like to post only the athlete's reaction time on the large screens in the stadium. So they don't often post the reaction times of the guide runners. But if a guide runner is DQ'd, they may show it then. Okay, let's skip to the next one, Jerry. What to watch for, what we watch for, or what umpires are watching for is running or wheeling out of lane on the curved section of the track for races run completely within a lane or those that start in lanes. There are also athletes or officials are also looking for obstruction of another athlete by one athlete, abandoning the race by an athlete, and at the finish, whether or not there's an athlete has to finish before the guide runner in T11 and T12 races. And we read the hub of the center of the hub of the leading wheel in wheelchair and race runner races. And if the tether is released before the athlete finishes, the athlete and guide finishes, then it's a DQ. And don't be afraid to, if you're a track referee, don't be afraid to ask the photo finish people about this because they tend to have better pictures or better images. Okay, Jerry?
David, does the SIS system get hooked up to only the odd numbered lanes in these cases?
No, it gets set up for all lanes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, because the athlete and the guide runner are running as a team. Therefore, they have to have their SIS or start information system hooked up.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. So running out of lane again, this is the same rule we just went over. Wheeling or stepping on the line is not a DQ if it happens only once in a race or in a multi-round event, and no advantage is gained. And it's recorded in the race and the results and the start list for the next round if it occurs as an L, with an L on the start sheet for this next round. And the second time wheeling or stepping on the line is a DQ if it happens in the next round of the same race. So if it happens in a 200 meters in the heats or a qualifying round, and it happens in the semifinals, then the finals, the athlete is DQ'd. Okay, and for races completely run in lanes, wheeling or stepping completely over the line is still a DQ, but some part of the foot, shoe, or wheel must still be in contact with the line, or it will be a DQ. And if no material advantage is gained and one step on or over the line, it's not a DQ. And this now we're going to have a series of pictures, and you will see that the guide runner is on the outside of the athlete and is finishing before the athlete. And therefore the guide and the athlete, or the athlete in lane 5 in this instance, would be disqualified. Okay, and same situation here. The guide is finishing before the athlete. And the next picture, Jerry, this is relating to the tether, and you can see that the athlete and you can see the tether is missing in lane 3. I believe that's lane 3, but you cannot see that it's missing in lane 5. So they've released the tether before the finish line if it shows like this. And this is a complete release of the tether before the athlete finishes. And it used to be that they could release the tether 10 meters before the finish line, but now it says they cannot release a tether until they both have crossed the finish line. Okay. For T11 road events, this is just for information. Generally, there isn't a call room, but there should be for elite athletes. And they, again, T11 athletes must run with a guide. They must use a tether and they must use it properly. But they do not need to use eye patches or eye masks or opaque glasses. That is optional for T11 athletes in road events, like marathons, or it could be 5K or 10K road events. And this is an actual situation that happened last year, or in 2019, sorry. And the question is, did the guide finish before the athlete? Because you cannot see the athlete. How can you tell, and who makes the decision? Well, first off, what's important is you need to know that the finish line is what you're seeing. And then you have to look at whether or not the athlete, if you can see part of the athlete, then the athlete is finishing before the guide, but you can't see the athlete in this picture, but we don't know if the picture is taken from an angle or not. We don't really know that. Who makes the decision? It's the referee that makes the decision, and it might be the off-track referee. Okay, Jerry, you can flip to the next one. The guide must not push, pull, or propel the athlete at any time during a running event. And this doesn't matter whether it's off track or on the track. So this is a video of an athlete from China and an athlete from the UK. So you can see the questions here. Now Jerry is going to show this again, and there's no problem with the Chinese athlete and guide. And how can you tell? Well, how you tell is you watch the shoulders of both. And if you see a jerking motion on the part of the athlete, then the athlete may be being pulled by the guide. And you will see that with the athlete from the UK. And this happened to be the semifinals in Rio. Jerry, can you keep showing
Yeah,
that?
sure. I was just going to point out that that position of their hands together right there is illegal now.
Right. And again, how can you tell? And you can tell by watching the shoulder of both the athlete and the guide runner. And if the shoulder of the athlete is jumping up and down, as you can see, it is here, then you can DQ. And who makes the decision? It's either the track referee or it could be the video referee that makes the decision. And in this case, I was the track referee in Rio, and I DQ'd this athlete, and the jury reinstated the athlete. And I'm not sure if they reinstated the athlete because it was a world record in the semifinal or not. I don't know. But sometimes it's way more obvious than it appears. And I don't know if we have a picture of next one, Jerry. We might have a video. No, I think we have some guide exchanges coming up.
Yeah, I don't think we have another video like that.
Okay. There used to be a video, and there is one available, and we can send it to you if need be, of
Sure.
an athlete and guide who are running in lane. I believe they're running in lane 7, and the athlete is being pulled by the guide runner. So for a 5,000 or a 10,000 meter race, athletes in the T11, T12 category can have 2 guides. If they do, they must declare on which lap they will change guides. And sometimes this is a back and forth because they may want to change guides on the home straight, and we will only allow it on the back straight. So they may not get exactly what they want. If they declare they're going to exchange guides and they don't, then the rule now is that the athlete will be disqualified. So here's a video of a good guide exchange.
For the uninitiated, and maybe your first time watching this in 4 years, maybe your first time watching this overall, but when they cross the line,
And you can see the guide runner
at the finish, ahead of the guy
moving in between the guide and the athlete and picking up the tether.
You can see the tether between them. That's an old style tether. Again, that's not legal at this time.
Yep.
But the idea is the same.
Right.
There's the guide who's gonna,
The guide has just entered the picture. And he's going to run between the two of them and then pick up the tether from the guide runner. And that's the only time in which the tether may be released by a guide is when they're doing a guide exchange.
yeah.
And this coming up this is the second one, and this may be a bad guide exchange. And so what are you looking for? You can see the guide is out there in lane 6 or so coming in,
That is for the third placer.
and then he's running out. So they didn't do a guide exchange in that instance, and that is the event that created the reason for having the rule, which is a new rule now, that says if the guide exchange doesn't occur, then the athlete and guide are DQ'd. So how can you tell? Well, first off, you should have officials over on the back straight watching the guide exchange. But if you look at the height of the second guide, he's much taller than the current guide. And you can see that they don't, from this video angle, they
See him
don't,
right there.
yeah,
There he is right there. That's him right there. And they just kind of shoot him away.
right. So he came in and the other guide said, no, I'm fine. So I'm going to carry on. Okay. So for T13 and T20, starting blocks linked to the start information system are also compulsory, as is a crouch start for races less than 800 meters, including the first leg of a 4x400 meter. They must use blocks connected to a start information system and so a crouch start and SIS. Often you will see, you won't be able to tell that a T13 athlete is visually impaired. No guide runner is allowed, and they often run in able-bodied events. So there's no difference really between a T13 and a, say, a T37 or a T38. You will also see that T20 athletes may request assistance to have their blocks set because they're not capable of setting their own blocks, and the assistant would normally be one of the starter's assistants. And there's a specific form that an athlete may use to fill out to determine where the blocks should be set. And that is how far the front of the blocks are from the start line and how far back the left block and the right block are set.
Hey, David,
Yep.
which athletes have to have blocks and use them?
Athletes up to T20 category must use starting blocks connected to a start information system.
Okay.
And if T11 and T12 are using a guide runner, then the guide runner must also use starting blocks connected to the start information system.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Okay. Now for racing chairs and race runners, which are now called frame runners, there is a courtesy pre-check by call room staff and starters assistants or ITOs 1 or 2 days before the competition occurs. And without the athletes in the throwing frame and with the athletes in a racing chair. some sort of a marking decal is put on the piece of equipment, and each piece of equipment still gets an inspection at the in the call room when they show up. And the reason for the courtesy pre-check is that if there is a problem with the piece of equipment, the athlete and or team has an opportunity to fix it. On the day of competition, racing chairs and race runner frames and helmets are re-inspected. Plus there is an ear canal inspection done. And that is for communication devices that might be between an athlete and a coach. And if the athlete and coach, they cannot instruct, the coach cannot instruct an athlete from within the competition area. And if the ear canal, in the ear canal is has some kind of a communication device, then that is considered a violation of the rule. With throwing frames, if there's an issue with a throwing frame, then call room judges or the event referee will go to the event site and do another inspection. And I've only seen that happen on one occasion, and that was in Doha in 2015. Okay, Jerry? Helmets are compulsory for all T31 to 34 and 51 to 54 athletes, as well as race running athletes. They must leave the call room wearing the helmet, and they must also wear the helmet on the warm-up track. And often we will, as ITOs, tell athletes to put their helmets on in the warm-up track, and they'll question it, but they'll still put it on. Okay. Racing chairs that have a speedometer that has a GPS component may be allowed to be used as long as the communication function is not used in the device or it is turned off. Racing chairs shall have 2 large wheels of 70 centimeters and 1 smaller front wheel, which is 50 centimeters. They are allowed to have only 1 plain round push rim on each of the large wheels. And that is, if they had more than 1, it would be like having gears on a bike. And they must demonstrate, the athlete must demonstrate that it has a functional braking and steering system for safety purposes. And this is both the racing chair and for the frame runner or race running frame. Okay. No mirrors are allowed, and the height from the ground to the bottom of the frame must be at least 50 centimeters. The frame shall incorporate a seat, and these are instructions for our NTOs and ITOs. Check that the seat and all elements of the seat are non-elastic. There are no fairings or similar devices to allow for improved aerodynamic performance. Nothing like that is allowed. No communication devices are allowed, except one-way communication to an athlete, but an athlete may not communicate with a coach outside the competition area. Side guards may be added to protect the athlete from wheels, and generally there's a wall test done within the call room, And the wall test is demonstrating that the frame or the seat is, if you push the wheelchair back and the wheels touch the wall before the seat, that's okay. But if you push it back and the vertical plane of the cage of the seat touches first, then it's an illegal chair. Lower extremities, legs and feet, or any relevant prosthesis are not allowed to touch the ground so as to propel the racing chair or stabilize it at the start of a race. And this is something that we look at as video referees. Sorry, Jerry, this is up to you now.
Okay. One of the other measurements we do is there's the width of the frame. It's not a discrete measurement. However, no part of the frame can stick out behind, as we showed you in the wall test, or in front, but also it can't stick out beyond the plane of the push rim on either rear wheel. Athletes in the 31 through 34 and 51 through 54 wheelchair racers, they're not going to use blocks, kind of common sense there. As David went through in great detail, they have to be wearing helmets. And again, it must be at all times and in the warm-up area as well. If there is time allowed in the schedule, often what we will do, say we have the 54 racers on, those are the big guys, the fast guys, and the one that all the media like to watch. We'll let them come out and we'll let them have a lap or perhaps a certain amount of time to go out and warm up on the track. But the second more important thing that they need to do is they have compensators. If you've never heard the term before, it's a mechanism on the chair that allows you to set it such that when you enter a turn, the wheel is turned to coincide with the radius of that curve so that the athlete can push with both arms with equal force and be able to accelerate into the turn and out of the turn. When they exit the turn, they reverse the direction of the compensator and it sets it back to straightaway. So it is really, really a huge thing to make the effort required to stay in the turn a lot less than it normally would be.
Jerry, can you describe how an athlete will adjust the compensator?
Do we have a picture of that coming up? I don't remember.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I certainly can. The athlete is pushing, and up in front of him on the center strut of the frame is the steering device, right? Okay, the steering device has a little mechanism with a rod on it, and it's a threaded rod. And what the athletes will do is when they're going around the track trying to set their compensators during that period that we allow them, they'll screw that rod in and out until they can push, and that chair will just follow the same curve radius all the way around the curve. Once they're set, they hit that rod again and move it, maybe 6 degrees in radius. They'll just hit it and it pops back to the straight direction. So there are two directions once they set it: go straight or go on the curve. But of course, every track is a little different, so they have to be able to adjust it for the track that they're on.
Good, thank you.
Sure. The start. The start is determined. In other words, how do you know an athlete is set up and ready for a legal start? The center of the hub of the front wheel must be behind the starting line. It's not as this thick. I forgot to change this slide, so my bad. It's the center hub. There's an axle inside the hub. The hub is larger than the axle. It's not the hub anymore. It's that center axle. That piece has to be behind the start line. Also, the athletes are not allowed to drop their feet or if they happen to be an amputee who's pushing in a wheelchair, because there isn't an option to do that. And I won't go into that here, why or how you would qualify to do that. But you can't let your feet or your prosthetic limb touch the ground. Sometimes in years past, people would put their feet on the ground as a way to help them not only be at the start by pushing their push rims, but also help prepare them with their feet. And we do not allow that. So it's something to watch for if you're at the starting line and looking for DQs. And here is an example of that. If you look at the upper wheel here, I hope can you see my arrow, David?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. You can see this hub, and there's the center of the hub. It's well behind the edge of the start line, which this yellow line is superimposed over it. And then you come down here and you see the center of that hub is pretty much sitting on top of the edge of the starting line, behind which the rule says you must be behind. So if you were the starter's assistant and saw them lining up in this orientation, you might walk up to this athlete and tell them to move back a little bit. So what to watch for the start as a review. There's not going to be a whole lot of movement when set is called for the wheelchair guys. The lower classes are a little jitterier though, so you sort of have to be able to kind of watch them. They can raise their arm if they just can't get themselves set. I mean, they do have functional limitations, and sometimes they just can't maintain position. So they will pull their arm up, and you can call the start off. Otherwise, athletes will just sometimes just sit up at the set command. The racing chair should be virtually still when the gun goes off. And again, for these athletes, holding them too long is not a good thing to do if you're the starter in the start team. The more you wait, the more difficult it is with some of these athletes to actually maintain that very still position. So just be aware of that. And this is just the standard commands are the same. On your marks, the athletes is back well behind the line. You move up towards the line. On the set command, you stay still. You see this young man, he's got his arms up, his elbows out, and his hands are up on top of the push rims right there. Classic starting positions. Gun goes off, and you can see it's just a downward shot, and they're off and running. David?
Yeah, okay. So what we have are a couple of comments about what's good to do as a starter. And that is that because wheelchair races, if something happens in the first 50 meters, the starter or a recall starter has the authority to recall a race for a restart if the collision occurs involving any athlete in the race. And this is a race of 800 meters and above. And it's not likely going to happen in an 800 if they're starting in lanes, but it still could happen. And the appropriate referee has the authority to take the appropriate action on receipt of umpire reports. So if an athlete disturbs the start or causes an accident, that athlete can be disqualified. Or they can have the race restarted with all athletes. And there should be a start referee close to the starter in case of any problems. Okay, Jerry? So this is an example of what to watch for. This is at the finish of a race. And what we see, other than the fact that neither of these athletes is wearing a helmet, this is before the helmet rule came into effect. And in fact, this may be a reason for having that. But you will see that the front wheel of the guy in blue has completely broken. And so where do you put the finish? Well, the finish is the the hub of the leading wheel, or the center of the hub of the leading wheel. So it should be somewhere where Jerry's showing the line right now. If you look at the next image, you will see a pretty good image of where that is. And in this case, it would be read by the inside camera rather than the outside camera.
Interesting way to win a race, huh?
Yeah, okay, and this is another wheelchair race and a race runner race. And you can see it's fairly close, but you can, I think, determine fairly easily, or photo finish people can determine very easily who the winner of the race is. And this is how you can tell this is a very close race, but the guy in lane 6 is the winner of the race because the center of the hub of the leading wheel is slightly ahead of lane 7 in this instance. Okay, so if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them. Serge, has anything come in the chat?
Nothing.
Nothing, okay.
We were
Then let's-
perfectly understandable this time then.
Yep. Carry on. It's up
Okay.
to you now, Jerry.
As we've talked about race runners are for the very lower end of the cerebral palsy class or brain injury, similar deficits. What is now the class 31s and 32s, and we mentioned earlier they will eventually become the 71s and 72s. This is how they may perform on the track, by using race runners. I'll show you some examples of it here in just a moment. They line up and start just like normal. They have feet. They use their feet to propel themselves on the track. They usually typically lean forward on a pad, have hold of the steering wheel. The steering wheel has brakes, and they can steer, obviously, to go around the corners. They don't have to have both feet on the ground. They can use starting blocks if they want. I think I have a picture of here coming up shortly that shows you an example of that. Just like in racing chairs, it's the center of the hub of the front wheel that must be behind the starting line. And it is also, just like David was showing in those photo finish pictures, it is the demarcation for a finish. All these frame runners, race runners, must wear helmets, just like the racing guys. And if they're out there warming up on the warm-up track, if there is one, they have to have their helmets on there as well. Good practice, certainly, if you have a starter's assistant, walking up and down the front line, as I showed you, just checking and make sure that the center of the hub is behind that back of the starting line in advance of the start taking place. Okay. Malfunction here. So here's an example of a number of frame runner, race runner athletes lined up here. If you look in lane 7 here, where my cursor is, you can see the set of blocks back there. I don't think he has a pad there on the left foot, but he does on his right foot. And here again, here's another athlete, has both feet on pads, no starting blocks. This athlete has their left foot on a pad. So you don't have to use both pads. You don't have to use a starting block at all. Remember, it is only the visually impaired and in the intellectually impaired, T11, 12, and 13, and 20s, that must use starting blocks. And we'll show you just a little bit of movie. Typically, on a standard WPA approved track, That's 1.22 meters in width. Even though these are wider than racing chairs, we perceive that to be enough room to be able to take corners and race. In the United States, some of our tracks are much narrower than that, and we've had some issues dealing with things. Occasionally, we might allow the race runners to perform across 2 lanes, but let me show you what this start looks like. And just as you would for racing chairs, or just as you would for able-bodied individuals, you can see that like let me see if I can bring this back. I think right there, the guy in lane 3 just touched the line. He came back off of it, and that was the only time he touched. So again, that follows the new rule. 1 touch is okay. But we make rulings on these guys just like we would everyone else, using the new rule. They're fun to watch. These guys are great. You can see he's actually sitting on it. Some of these guys will lean on it. I don't know if we have yeah, you can see this gentleman right here. He's actually leaning on a pad. He's sitting on one. He's sitting on one. It depends on your physical makeup and the functional limitation that's due to your disability that allows you to do one way or the other. And you can see most of these guys are using both limbs. Some guys will have disabilities such that they can only really provide power onto the track with 1 foot. So the other one just kind of is pulled up next to them during the race. Just another start, some younger guys. This modality of competing is extremely popular in Europe. Can't even speak. They actually have clubs that this is what they do. So this is a very popular concept in Europe. It is slowly growing in the US. You'll see it at some of our competitions. There will be a Grand Prix in Phoenix, Arizona coming up here in May. And so far we have 2 entries, which is small, but we're getting there. It's becoming more accepted. But as you can imagine, anytime you have to buy a piece of equipment like that, the cost is not insignificant.
And I have been advised that there is only 1 athlete in Canada who is currently race
Really?
running or
Okay.
front running.
Got it. Athletes that are T61 and 64s, that means athletes with prosthetic limbs, upper extremity and lower extremity, bilateral and single, or the T42s through 44s, who don't have prostheses. They still have their remaining limbs, but the functional limitation for that athlete is somewhat similar to an equivalent category in the 60s series. The athletes can use starting blocks if they want. If they use starting blocks, they should be connected to the SIS system. A crouch start is not required for these guys, and I'll show you some examples of why not. They can request assistance. Some of them can't actually have the range of motion at their trunk to be able to reach down and set their blocks. So pieces of a form will be filled out in the call room or prior to that, and it will be brought out along with the call room staff and given to the starter's assistant, and the start team will be allowed to help them set their blocks up. Indeed, they don't have to take a 4-point stance, and they can use 1 foot pad if they want, or they can use both. It doesn't really matter. What to watch for at the start. The T64 athletes, which are single amputee below the knee, are really very powerful. They're kind of normal. They've lost part of their leg that's below the knee, and it usually has a flex foot on it, and they can really spring off the starting blocks with great force, and they actually perform quite well, have great times to put in. The 61s are the most severely impacted of this group. They are bilateral above the knee amputees, so they don't have any need to flex. Usually they stand up quite straight and look very, very tall because they can't bend their knees at the start. They'll look kind of funny and awkward. For those of you that may be starters, these guys are really awkward and they tend to not stand still very long at the start. So a general concept is to carefully watch these guys. And when you think you have a moment to get them going, fire the gun. Certainly on wet tracks, the 61s are really kind of scary going around a corner on a wet track. It's really difficult when it's slippery. An example would be a sprint in the 200. And like I said before, the T61 athletes either don't have a knee in their prosthetic limbs, or they have one and it's usually dialed up to be so stiff it doesn't really bend, because it doesn't really facilitate their ability to ambulate around the track. Here's a picture of an example. And this gentleman here from the United States, you can see he has no knees. He's amputated about right here. And this fits up over his remaining limb, comes straight down. And this is actually him right here in a race at another time. But you can see flex foot, straight. You watch them running down the road and down the track, and you can see they typically will kind of pull their leg out to the side a little bit because they don't have that flexed knee, and it doesn't give them the room to extend their leg forward and plant that flex foot. So they come out and then bring it back in. This gentleman over here is the T64 we talked about in the slide before. The 64 is here. You can see he has a knee here. This is his remaining prosthetic limb, and he's got his knee is right there. So that prosthetic limb is coming up over the knee, and he can actually flex that knee and plant that flex foot. It gives him an advantage over an individual such as Regis here. But they're great fun to watch. Interestingly, these guys, once they get over about 400 meters, it's almost like they're shifting gears. They go around that corner, and they just kind of stand up straight, and the stride they get is just amazing. And they can give these guys a heck of a run for their money. Here's an example of the guys at the start. You can see what a huge reach that is to get your hand down on the track and get ready for a start. David, this is yours. I'm sorry.
And now a little bit about relays.
Yes.
All athletes, again, need to start their running or wheeling within their exchange zone. This is a new rule. Exchange zones are 40 meters for wheelchair athletes and 30 meters for all others. Now, there is also a universal relay, which is mixed gender and mixed sport class. And the mixed sport class, a baton is used only in T11, T12, and T20 races. For other classes, passing is by touch. And sometimes, and that includes the universal relay, it's done by touch, because many of the categories of athletes or classes of athletes cannot hold a baton and either run or wheel at the same time. And again, like able-bodied, it's the position of the baton or touch that determines whether it's a valid exchange or not. Either the runner or wheelchair athlete may touch for a valid exchange. It doesn't matter who touches whom for it to be a valid exchange. Okay. And for universal relay, it's 2 women and 2 men, and the sport classes are, the first leg is T11 to T13. The second leg is a T42, 47, or a T61, 64. And the third leg is a T35 to 38. And the fourth leg is a wheelchair athlete, either a T31 to 34 or a T51 to 54. And no more than 2 athletes from sport classes T13, 46, 47, or 38, or 54 may be used on a team. And that is to make it fair for all teams, that you're not overly pumped up with high functioning athletes. Okay, Jerry. Once the race is over, for all athletes, once the race is over, they need to exit the field of play. And generally in larger competitions, they go to a post-event control center. And again, this is where they find out about whether or not they're going to be winning a medal or getting a medal in the victory ceremony, or whether they're going to win the lottery and have to pee into a cup, as in doping control. And this is usually a room or a tent near the finish line. And before getting to the post-event control center, they will usually have to go past a media scrum. And they always do at major competitions, have media scrums. When that's where the media are asking questions of particular athletes, usually those who win. Okay. So just to summarize, there's a lot to watch for with track events with T11, T12 athletes starting, running out of lane or stepping on the line, obstruction, pushing, pulling by a guide runner, finishing the race, and guide exchanges in a 5,000 and 10,000. That can be pretty tricky, all of those things. And are there any questions? If there are no questions at this stage, that's great. But if you have a question and it comes to you after the session, feel free to email either myself or Jerry, and we will be happy to answer the question. We'll be happy to help with any World Para Athletics questions you may have.
And we hope to see you at some of our future competitions for sure.
Yeah.
Greatly appreciate the interest on everybody's part.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for attending.